So first of all, thank you very much to Professor Kingma and colleagues for including me today. It's provided a number of really good things for me personally. One is that it provided a reason to enter the world again, which actually proved to be quite a difficult thing to do this morning. And I thought about it a couple of times to just stay home in my sweatpants and do this online. But also just to learn to get back on the subway and the overground again. So I apologize for being late. So there was, as you would expect, a human incident on the train, and therefore I had to find another way to here. So I apologize for being late. So I also want to welcome Professor Kingma back to KCL, and I hope that this is the first of many gatherings in which people across the university who are interested in medicine, health, and philosophy come together to talk about what they are doing and thinking, worried about, etc. So I'm going to sort of move us in a different direction for my talk. One is that it is a workshop paper. I do not have a paper, and it is something that I am working on. And two is that it's going to be more public healthy than medicine. And I hope that that's going to be okay, and I hope that you sort of enjoy that as well. So in terms of the interdisciplinarity of it, my own thinking, I guess I don't know where one discipline starts and one discipline ends and where I'm supposed to separate these two out. So what I've tried to do today is try to make it more interesting to people who are interested in philosophy of science. I may not succeed, but you may find something interesting in that. The second thing is that I have a couple of presentations that I have to do in the next couple of weeks. So today is philosophy of medicine. There's a global ethics session that I have to present at, and there's a development, and all of them want me to say whatever I want to say. So I was like, how can I write one thing for three rather than three different things, And so today is trying to work on that. So what I'm going to ask you to do is sort of take a walk with me for 30 minutes. And here's the sites that you're going to see, because I don't have PowerPoints. I don't know if that's helpful for people online or in person or whatnot. I've not been a very good person with PowerPoints when it comes to philosophy. I thought we sort of usually use our words and get people to pay attention to our face and our voice, but I don't know what's happening these days. So here's what I'm interested in. I'm interested in what is the last 2 years brought about in terms of cause and causation. Have we learned anything new? Has it raised anything new for us? Any new problems, any new issues? And I want to, and this is what I've been thinking about, and I want to sort of think out loud with you about that. The three areas that I want to talk to you about is, one is that I'd like to return to our debates about social determinants of health. And what is it that this has, or for the last, this COVID pandemic has made me think about, and what I sort of consider, is there a problem here? Is there something new or novel? The second is that I'd like to think about and revisit this issue around human diversity and causal explanations. And I think some of you will sort of find some sort of resonance in that. And the third thing is that I'd like to talk about the possibility that a cause for a disease can have both different dimensions in that it has a causal role that is both harmful and that is beneficial. And the politics around causal explanations, I think, turns on who benefits and who harms, and whether they want to have the cause addressed or not. And I'll sort of try to, so those are three things, is that social determinants of health, does this sort of do anything new or different? Two is human diversity. Three is this idea of causal harms, and whether that helps us think more about how to explain some things in the world. So In terms of the debates about social determinants of health, I don't know how familiar all of you are on screen or in person about the philosophy of science debates, or even the political philosophy debates about social determinants of health. And it's sort of not enough time to go through all of that. But let me just, if I could say it in 2 sentences, there were, according to sort of some people, there is a question in the area of social epidemiology about what counts as a real cause and what doesn't. And there was a debate that somehow, in order for something to count as a real cause of disease, it had to be a natural kind. And that social causes of disease are not as sort of strong or have as good explanatory value as natural kinds. And there's that one kind of issue. Then there was many other debates about the actual inability of us to, for example, you could show the causal pathway of an organism or infection organism causing disease. But when it comes to social factors, you couldn't actually find the causal pathway. And therefore, it was very hard for us to be able to sort of ascribe responsibility, both moral or sort of ontological responsibility to this disease, etc. There's many other kinds of debates that was going on. So has this pandemic given us anything new, or has it brought us anything, or is it just simply sort of, kind of detailing or illustrating what we already know? So let me try to bring this to more of a sort of practical and tractable issues, that the simple sentence of SARS-CoV-2 has caused millions of deaths. So the question is, are you satisfied with that statement as being a satisfactory explanation, or as SARS-CoV-2 being the cause of that phenomenon? And I think that there is enough of a group of people and enough of the world that believes that that is a satisfactory answer. So SARS-CoV-2 causes COVID, the disease. People die from that disease. And the way to prevent death from SARS-CoV-2 is we've invented vaccines that prevent the SARS-CoV-2 virus from not infecting, but once infected, that they don't lead to serious death, right? So this seems to be a satisfactory causal story, and it also has produced a sufficient solution that this is the way that you want to do it. So why would anyone have a problem with that kind of causal story, right? So if you are listening at the same time, you will hear that the cause of this pandemic, and particularly of certain groups of people, is because of something called structural injustice, right? Or structural racism. So how can you reconcile this story that there is a SARS-CoV-2 that's caused these deaths, and then at the same time also have this sort of narrative or story that says structural racism or structural injustice has caused these deaths from the pandemic? And I think that the social determinants of health literature has given us the ability to trace the pathways between how social conditions expose people to a virus that creates illness and death, right? But we still are not in a place that says you would have the dominant narrative as being structural injustice has caused death, right? And so let me perhaps take 2 steps back and take you to a historical example about the spread of smallpox among the Native American population in North America in the 18th century. So if you were to say, why did the Native Americans die in such large numbers in late 18th century? The causal explanation is that they all died of smallpox, right? So that is one explanation that seems to be true, and it sort of explains it. But there is something missing here, which is that the exposure to smallpox was because of colonial settlers coming into their land and either exposing them unintentionally or examples of purposefully exposing Native Americans to smallpox in a variety of different ways. So the story, or the causal story, that smallpox decimated a population of Native Americans is true, but then it would be unsatisfactory because you're not also getting the causes of that exposure to smallpox among the Native Americans, right? And this, I think, is important. And what we are seeing now in relation to COVID is the truncation of the causal story about what causes COVID and COVID deaths. And the implications are enormous. And this is where ethics and epistemology come together, which is that once you start identifying causal mechanisms, then you're going to start to allocate moral responsibility towards those causes. And we have a situation here where different people want to be able to ascribe moral responsibility to different actors in the causal story. So I think that the COVID pandemic has illustrated that for a large number of people now, through this epidemic, people are seeing that there are actually, it's not just the virus that is the causal component, but actually there's background social conditions that expose people to the virus that creates death. But we still are not clear, and I think even I, and as a group of philosophers who are interested in causal explanations and causal components, are not quite sure how to complement one explanation with the other. The idea of SARS-CoV-2 causes infection and death versus the exposure to SARS-CoV-2 is due to various kinds of causes that then causes death. And I think that this is still something that needs to be addressed. And the implications of this are not just interesting from the causal explanation sort of literature, but also there's lots of political and ethical implications of it that we still need to figure out. The second thing that I want to highlight is that this pandemic has, for me, and I think also for people interested in causes and causation, really brought to the forefront the difficulty that science, particularly epidemiology and vaccine trials and public health policy, has with diversity in human beings. So what I mean by that is that there are various examples. So many of you are now familiar with the famous modeling that was done at Imperial in the beginning of 2020 in January and February. And the modeling that was done there basically assumed that all human beings in a society would be uniform. They would have the same level of exposure risk. They would have the same kind of infection risk, and they would have the same kind of mortality risk. So the rates that were used was as if we were all going to be the same kind of bodies, and that the deaths were a huge number of deaths. And this is one of the reasons that the policies for lockdowns were implemented. What didn't happen in that modeling was the idea that there was great diversity among people, and some people would more likely be sort of at risk for death than other people, and what would be the different kinds of interventions that one needs to do in order to protect the people that are more at risk versus less at risk. So that's one example of the belief or the lack of interest in the role of human diversity in different kinds of models. The couple of other examples are that when the vaccine trials were being done, as you know, the population that can be studied has to be of a certain kind according to vaccine trial rules. It can't be any reproductive age women. It cannot be any older people. It cannot be any people with comorbidities. It cannot be children. And therefore, you end up with a certain group of people as being the test subjects. But then when you have to assess whether these vaccines should be approved and rolled out into the population, the people that you care about most are older people, people with comorbidities, people with, sort of who might be of reproductive age, etc. So there is a fundamental problem here, which is that people think that it is okay to use one standard in, sort of vaccine trials and then simply apply them. So if there's children, we'll just sort of reduce it in a different way. If they're older, we'll do various kinds of things. This is also true not only for vaccines, but all the different kinds of treatments that we've also been looking at, is that there is simply an erasure of the diversity of human beings. And when people are trying to assess whether we should use them or not, then that's where it comes in of what does this mean for different kinds of people? Well, the vaccine trials, the trials didn't look at that. So what are we supposed to do? Well, we don't know. We'll have to sort of go back and ask them, well, they're not going to run the trials again. So what are we going to do? Well, we'll sort of see what happens. We'll make the best of it, etc. So this is not, I think, a minor problem. I think this is a fundamental problem. And it is a problem not only in epidemiological reasoning, but we also know that this is a problem in policy making when it came to public health, which is that the idea was that, well, let's imagine our average citizen and what does the average citizen need to do to protect themselves from this threat. And so the idea was that you stay at home, you can work from home, you'll be able to communicate from home, you'll be able to earn your living from home, and the public services and everything else will be provided for you, etc. And that idea is not only something that is new to public health, or is not something that's only relevant to public health. This is something that government policies do all the time, which is that they think about the average citizen. How does this going to affect the average citizen? And then the outliers, those people that are not the average citizen, that are not middle class, that are not white in particular cases, that are not able-bodied, etc., will be dealt with after the majority or the average person is going. And that's exactly where we saw the greatest harms happening in this country. And I think that this inability for us to think about diversity is profoundly linked to the fact that our causal explanations are truncated. So we want to be able to explain causes in a way that we think will have the kind of easiest explanation, the smoothest explanations. If we think about all human beings as being similar organisms, then we can provide very brief causal stories. And then our solutions will also be based on sort of imagining that our people are also just sort of harmonious or unanimous. And then our solution will be to sort of deal with them, and then we'll deal with the remainder of the people. And I'm arguing here that is not just a question about equity, in that there's a few people that are being left out, but it's actually fundamental to our understanding of causal pathways if we don't actually incorporate diversity of human beings within it. The third part that I want to point out is that this causal story and the debates between how long or how short our causal story should be, or simple or complex, are not only in the sort of domain of epidemiology regarding what's the best scientific solution to the problem, but that causal story is very much happening at a global level, and the political architecture at a global level is actually competing and negotiating about which of those causes to recognize and which not. So to give you a much more practical example, at present, we are having discussions about a new pandemic treaty. And the pandemic prevention treaty, or the pandemic preparedness treaty, is seen as an alternative to something called the international health regulations. And the idea is that the international health regulations have failed in preventing a pandemic. That was what they were supposed to do. And they have failed, it's argued, is because the rights and obligations of states to each other were not clear enough, or they were biased towards certain kinds of states. And so what we want is a pandemic preparedness treaty that is more rigorous, more comprehensive, and essentially more restrictive on states. And what is happening is that we have the traditional fights going on, which is that nation states do not like their sovereignty to be limited for anything. And so we have, yet again, this is just another opportunity or another instance where, international cooperation is trying to contain national sovereignty, and states don't like that, especially the big states. So they are resisting that. We also have a long-standing known tension between the idea of trade and disease control being at tension or at odds with each other, which is that in order to have trade across nation states, you need to have freedom of movement in goods, but that's also where disease gets spread. And so this has been something for the last 200 years that nation states have been trying to balance. And what's been happening more recently is that the idea is that nation states are trying to make the argument that in the case of a health threat, there is an overwhelming moral, ethical basis to intervene into that state, to provide assistance to that state in order to control the epidemic that's happening in that country. So if you think about the Ebola epidemic of 2014, I believe, is that countries were essentially going in because there was a weak state and essentially playing the role of the government in trying to control the outbreak. And after that, the rich countries got together and they created a pandemic force, I think it's called, where every time, if there's an outbreak, then this force would immediately fly in and help the country control the pandemic. Of course, as you can tell from what I am saying and what I'm intonating, it's actually the rich countries saying we don't want it to leave that country, and so we are sending a force in order to protect it ourselves from it, right? And so the idea here is that this pandemic happened, according to some, because the original country where it came from was too big to invade in order to control the pandemic, right? So that was the idea, is that it's sort of one of the reasons why the pandemic happened is because that country was too powerful and to be able to, anyone else to be able to intervene, and even the international organization. So what we have now is whether this pandemic preparedness treaty is going to be able to control or get this sort of balance between national sovereignty, global well-being, global health, the idea of rights and responsibilities. But what I want to add to this is that what's going on is that the cause of the spread of COVID during this, over the last 2 years, what we now understand is that aside from the original point at which a new virus was created, the way it was spread within China, that country, but also across countries, was because of various different kinds of globalization sort of phenomena, right? So basically it went from major metropolis to major metropolis, and then it went from there onwards. So, but the question about whether the cause of the pandemic is SARS-CoV-2 or whether it's actually also that these routes of transmission were ungoverned or were not willing to be constricted by the countries is something that is being debated in the discussions about the pandemic treaty. Is that because that cause is both something that is advantageous to some actors and potentially harmful to another actors, whether or not it actually becomes identified as a cause of a pandemic or a threat of the pandemic. And I think this idea that a cause of a disease can be both something that is causing the disease as a harm, but also is beneficial or advantageous to another person, we haven't looked at before. I don't think that this is the same as a dual use issue. This is not where something can be used for either good or harm. I think that this is a different kind of phenomenon. And some of the politics that we are seeing around the structural injustice debates or whether we hold governments responsible or not is very much about whether the causal story for disease and death has in it components that essentially are in the interests or in sort of to the advantage of some people, while they also cause harm to another people. And we don't want, and why we're seeing a struggle over this kind of narrative that the causal story is because once you attach harm to those kinds of causal pathways, then you're going to have them open up for political negotiation. And this, I think, is something that people do not want. So thank you very much for giving me the space to think out loud on those three causal dimensions that I was talking to you about. So the first one is that I think the social determinants of health is very much now embedded and people are willing to talk about it. But I think we still haven't really reconciled our own, even among the philosophers, how do you sort of take these two kinds of explanations? One is the virus explanation and one is the social conditions explanation, and to be able to satisfactorily situate one in the other or to sort of sit them side by side. And this is, I think, really important. The second thing is that I think how long or short your causal story is also going to be very much reflected in your tolerance for diversity in human beings and whether you are willing to take into account those kinds of diversity or not. And third, I think at a global level, what we see here is that there is very much a debate and discussion over the causal pathways of this pandemic, because one causal pathway might be harmful to one person, but it's actually an advantage to another. And the negotiations about whether we're going to address them or not is very much shows us that even at a micro level, we can see that causal pathways to disease can be both not just sort of neutral sort of components, but actually can be both harmful to some individuals and advantageous to others. And so there's very much ethics and epidemiology quite embedded within the causal story there as well. Okay, thank you very much.